Representative News of International Petroleum Enterprises. I'd like to thank you all for the wonderful presentation. I have three quick comments and a question on the education. Lots of money's been spent on the education, and as Mr. Kurtzman mentioned, in Saudi Arabia in particular, they spend a lot of money on different issues, and particularly education, and yet there is a huge mismatch between the needs and the availability. And unfortunately, in the case of Saudi Arabia, it looks like that almost half of graduates have done their work in religious studies. On the youth, yes, they're frustrated. They're probably vocal, they're mobile, but the polls that I've seen basically says that their political views and even the religious views are not that much different from the rest of the public. So why do we have to highlight the youth and the movement and so on? And on the emphasis on the domestic nature of the protests and not mentioning the outsiders and so on, the reality is that the Arab-Israeli issue is at the core, and people are really concerned about that issue. And the support that their leaders, the Arab leaders, are getting from the outside is something that we cannot ignore. So it's kind of the hatred for that kind of relationship, it's kind of embedded in what we have seen. But on the question side, we cannot ignore the fact that oil is really the most important issue as far as the West is concerned in the Arab world. And yet, today, there was hardly a mention of oil. Mr. Kurtzman correctly, pointed out about some of the benefits that it would have, like for Iraq in particular. But even that perception that oil can really help Iraq is fading. There's a lot of reneging. There's a strong resistance to even the first contract that went to the Chinese. The oil companies and service companies, they have second thoughts about some of the decisions that they've made. So the question is, we just completed a major study on the political changes in the Arab world and the impact that it would have on the oil industry. And I hope that some of you at least can address that. And I'd like to see what you think of that particular issue. Thank you.
I actually, in my introductory remark, identified access to oil and gas as a strategic national interest that the U.S. administration is thinking about. But Anthony has something.
Let me make a couple of points. One, the mismatch between education and job creation is just as great in Egypt and Iraq as it is in Saudi Arabia. And if anything, the country that has seen one of the worst collapses in education is Iraq, in part because of the role of the Sadrists, but also because that ministry got so little attention over recent times, and in fact was almost exempt from major aid activity, again, partly because of the Sadrist activity. So you look across here and you have to be very, very careful. Simply because you have secular education doesn't mean it creates jobs or opportunities. When you talk about youth, why do you have to take them into account? First, because they are the dominant part of the population now, and they are going to be young and growing for a very long period of time. But second, I don't know what polls you've seen. The polls I've seen are much less, shall we say, sanguine, and they are particularly less sanguine about young men. The problem lies in the difference between political consciousness, insecurity, anger, and, among other things, polls that, for example, in one of the Arab development reports indicated that more Moroccan college graduates wanted to immigrate than stay in Morocco. That's not a sign of security, even in a relatively moderate and secular country. On oil, The reality is, I think we didn't get into it simply because it is so clear. And there was a projection just 2 days ago, the Department of Energy issued its latest estimate. It showed the United States will be dependent on oil for 41% of its liquids through 2035, which is as far as they projected. That simply says there will be absolutely no meaningful difference in U.S. strategic dependence on petroleum as far as we can model, and this is by the Department of Energy. And that did not include indirect imports. Asia uses oil to produce our goods, or American dependent on the stability of the global economy, where other countries have to import. But the reality is, when you look at the numbers, only a very narrow range of oil countries translate oil wealth now into something that gives their population real support. Some of it is Qatar and Kuwait are wealthy enough, the UAE, so they can do it easily, particularly for a domestic population. Saudi Arabia does it structurally and has for something like 3 5-year plans. The other oil countries simply don't. And the problem, particularly in cases like Iraq, is I've seen some of the models that were used both by the government and the oil companies in job creation. I think everyone outside realizes these are absolutely ridiculous. They're an order of magnitude to 2 orders of magnitude higher than the job requirements created by any other petroleum sector in the region. The problem is oil wealth is spent through native populations in ways which are not created by jobs in the petroleum sector. And estimates by the Department of Energy and the International Energy Agency show that you'll get to about half to 60% of the production goals set by the Iraqi government about 5 years later than the Iraqi government. And in countries today which do not have high oil wealth per capita, and the EIA, the Energy Information Agency, maps those quite well, given current population growth, there will be a steady decline in per capita oil wealth in spite of the major increases in oil prices. And those countries do not rank meaningfully in terms of overall per capita income relative to non-oil countries, even in the Middle East. So what's sometimes called the petroleum disease is still a major problem for most countries and will remain so.
Can I say something? The question of the youth, I think, is embedded in the larger issue of demographics. I'll give you just an example. In the 1960s, the Syrian population numbered in the few millions. State policies, welfare policies, were able to satisfy a plurality of these people and some of their dependents. Today, the population of Syria is 22 to 23 million that are mostly outside the circle of beneficiaries from these state policies. That alone creates a very serious problem. That's why I was focusing on demographics. The second point is the point about the youth. And the reason why this makes it explosive is because this is the first generation in the past, say, 10 years, or a mixture of generations, maybe 1.5 or 2 generations, the past 10 to 15 years, grows up to know for a fact that they, as far as their perception, that is, that they have few opportunities, if at all, inside Syria or inside the countries in which they exist. And that makes for a pressure cooker situation that developed over more than 10 years. I've been recently in Egypt, Lebanon, and Syria, and when you speak to the youth, you also realize, add the pressure cooker effect, add the demonstration effect in Tunisia and Egypt, but also add the exposure effect. These are very well connected and wired youth. even if they are not from upper or middle class backgrounds. And add to that the research right now that's being conducted on the youth in the region speak of an ideological shift. A lot of these people are not as encumbered as their mothers and fathers with Islamism. So we see something like post-Islamism developing. It's not anti-Islamism, but it's post-Islamism, sometimes even post-Islam or post-communalism. We see a post-Arab nationalism develop, also not against Arab nationalism and so on, but we see the youth coming together for basic needs and basic freedoms that actually are quite common across the Arab world, from Libya to Bahrain. So the numbers and the level of disenfranchisement among the youth, I think, makes for an explosive situation that we are likely to see in other countries, I think, in the coming 5 years.
We do have a question from someone watching the live streaming. One of the features of the Arab Spring that has not come up so far is the apparent irrelevance of Israel in the playing out of events. Can panelists comment on the impact of the Arab revolts on Israel's own regional policy? Israel has barely been touched on, although there are questions about how, let's say, for example, the fall of the Assad regime would impact inter-Arab and Arab-Israeli policies. So that's the question. Can anyone comment on how Israel is seeing this and how Israel should be reacting to this? Anthony?
I think we need to be very careful, because when we talk about Israel, it's a little like talking about the United States. We are very skilled at disagreeing on everything as a country, and so is Israel. But the events of just yesterday, I think, are an indication. When Hamas and Fatah agreed, for however long it lasts and for however real it may be, to reach some kind of rapprochement, almost before it was announced, Prime Minister Netanyahu said that Fatah and the Palestinian Authority would have to choose between them. Now, as yet, we have not seen a major shift across the border that has affected the arming of Hamas. But the issue that was raised earlier is a very real one. Whatever is happening with this spring, it's going to be an interesting choice for Egypt. And what is kind of interesting is it's not clear what choice they'll make, because with the pipeline problems that have occurred and the dollar income that is affected, there is a major buildup taking place in the Egyptian security forces in the Sinai. And because smuggling has to come, if it's arms, from outside the immediate border area, it's not quite clear how this is going to really work out in terms of security and the armament of Hamas. I think that it's also not clear how the Arab Spring has affected Hamas, because you can talk on the one hand about secularism, but on the other hand, Hamas is very actively not only dealing with Fatah now, but with its own Islamist extremists who are a threat to Hamas, and that's presenting problems within Hamas's stability. More broadly, I think we, though, need to wait. Well, the spring is largely a matter of people concerned with their own needs, not some sort of strategic role or concept of the Arab world or the Arab-Israeli issues. They're dealing with domestic perceptions and domestic issues. And inevitably, there's a morning after. But that morning after hasn't come yet, so how seriously anyone is going to turn toward the Arab-Israeli issue, I think we need to give it time.
Israel, in general, likes the status quo in the region. It doesn't like instability and an upset to the established order. The Israelis were very close to the Mubarak regime. Long after President Obama had stopped talking to President Mubarak. Senior Israeli officials were still speaking to him. I know one that spoke to Mubarak the day before he resigned. They had a nice conversation, an old friend of his from 20 years. There's not much pressure on domestic pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu to move forward with the peace process at this point in time. With no domestic pressure and feeling wary of the Obama administration, we're not likely to see any progress on that track. In general, Israel needs to feel strong to make concessions, and having lost one of its most important allies in the world in Mubarak, it's really worried about what will happen next. It's, in my opinion, it's welcomed what they're seeing in Syria, because Syria, Bashar al-Assad has been such a source of instability in the region since he came to power in 2000. He's made decisions that his father would have never have done. He's basically in Hezbollah's back pocket. Hezbollah took him to war in 2006, and he didn't see that. Hafez al-Assad would have never allowed that to happen. So they view him as immature, and any instability in Syria is some type of benefit. On the Hamas track, I have to disagree with Anthony. I think Hamas has benefited from the fall of Mubarak because Mubarak was very wary of Hamas. He saw Hamas as just an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood from which it descended when it declared itself in 1987. So he was very reluctant to really engage with Hamas and move any of that reconciliation, Hamas-Fatah reconciliation, forward. And the release of the soldier Gilad Shalit, which Omar Suleiman was negotiating, never really moved forward because Mubarak really didn't want to deal with Hamas. Now that he's no longer on the scene, his policy of the embargo of Hamas and really blockading any type of aid into or movement of goods into Gaza is going to be reconsidered and changed. So you have to, when we look at Israel and in the Egypt tract, it's pretty much lost so much that it will not, likely not to move forward at all on any type of negotiations with the Palestinians, or see any sense of urgency to do so at this point in time, barring something happening really with this UN declaration in September.
And Barak, even in light of the fact that the Egyptian military is still really central in Egypt, and that the Egyptian military has a close relationship with the American military, you still are concerned about this Iranian gain. I mean, wouldn't the Egyptian military set pretty clear limits on how far Israel can be provoked and how much influence Iran can have?
I think it's not clear what I mean when I talk about Iran gains. I don't think that Iran is going to make inroads with some of these countries. It's not going to make inroads in Egypt. There's really, in the long term, you're not going to see a rapprochement, an Egyptian-Iranian rapprochement. You're not going to see this increase in trade. There was a great book that came out in Beirut talked about Egyptian-Iranian trade and broad and horizons for that. That's just not going to happen. There's just too much distrust there. There's going to be a reduction in resistance to Iran. You're not going to see the Egyptian military is not going to move the civilians to persuade them to put pressure on to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, which is the big game at this point in time in the Middle East, preventing Iran from getting the bomb. It's just this whole resistance, this whole access to any type of movement, any type of gain on Iran is going to recede. With that Mubarak saw this whole big zero-sum game.
Okay, Bassam?
That's an important question because it's true. The Israelis are extremely worried, and if you have followed the Israeli press during the Egyptian uprising, you'll know the extent to which the Israeli community polity, especially the politicians, were concerned. And I think for good reason. In the past, Israel used to exist or existed in a sea of Arab pathetic incompetence, regimes that are completely incompetent, that are authoritarian, that violated all kinds of human rights and international law and so on. And in relation, Israel's abominable policies were kind of, on par or hidden or couched in external relations that allowed this to happen. But now these policies, whether it's racist settlements, ethnic cleansing, and what have you, with time are likely to show up more and are likely to be compared to things that are happening in Egypt that I think do not rise to the level of many of our desires, but are certainly not what we used to see in the past. So I think there is reason to be concerned. I think we also are seeing or are likely to see a return of politics to the region, especially if we have more such disturbances which would reduce the kind of incompetence of these Arab regimes around Israel.
Mustafa, do you have a question?
Thank you. My first question is for Dr. Cordesman. The point you brought up is about the Fatah and Hamas reconciliation. Now, Hamas won the free and fair election in 2006. Before that, Condi Rice pushed for the election, but we didn't like the outcome, so we didn't recognize them, got them overthrown. Now, after the reconciliation, Hamas is going to be part of the interim government. And then in elections, very likely they will come back to power in some coalition. What should be the American policy toward Hamas? Again, we'll boycott them or we'll do business with them. And a little more broadly, in Egypt, very likely, Muslim Brotherhood will either come to power in parliament or have a leading role. In Bahrain, any democratic arrangement with a pro-Iranian Shiite government. So what do we do? Are we going to play a game with the Islamist regimes? In Lebanon, they are part of it. Or what do we do about that for American interest? And second question, Professor Bassam, you said the government being organically linked. What do you see type of governments that are evolving after the post-dictatorial period? Do you think they will be like Western type democracy with church-state separation, or they will be like other countries like, Egypt, like Bahrain, like Iraq, that they will be indigenously, will have Islam play a role and there will not be much church-state separation. Thank you.
First, let me say I understand the views of the Arab members of this panel. I am obviously not Arab, and I am not about to take the view of Israel that people who feel that it somehow is so responsible for the problems in this area do. I also, frankly, find it a little difficult to go from the fact Hamas won an election largely because the Palestinian authorities, parties divided against each other, as being a reason the United States should somehow support a movement which has danced around whether or not it is calling for the destruction of Israel, but generally danced fairly solidly in the direction that it is. If anyone has illusions that this aspect of U.S. policy is going to change within the foreseeable future, they are illusions you should lose, because it isn't going to happen. What I would hope is Hamas would evolve, partly because it is having serious internal problems in Gaza with its own extremists. I would hope that Israel would not have preemptively made judgments about Hamas might change, because it is clear that there are leaders in Hamas that are willing to take a more pragmatic view, both in working with Fatah and in working with Israel. But on any given day, exactly who is to blame for what in this process of paralysis is a judgment which generally should be made with the conclusion everybody shares the responsibility for what is happening here, and to be very blunt, I think that responsibility lies far more among those directly involved than it does in the assumption that somehow we magically will change the world from the outside. I do believe that we face a major problem as these regimes evolve, and I think the answer to your second question is no one can answer it yet. What bothers me most is you need very strong country teams on the part of U.S. embassies. You need to give them discretion and money to run aid programs where those work. You can't solve the problem through public diplomacy at the Washington level, or by legislating in Congress, or by sending in NGOs without realizing that the track record of NGOs is often as negative as it is positive. But that would require boosting the State Department, providing discretionary aid funds, realizing that constantly reducing embassies is a bad idea. It would require a change in a culture in the State Department that frankly has favored fortress embassies over taking risks as foreign service officers, and it would require a fundamental revision in U.S. aid, which the QDDR has made brutally clear is not going to happen. So you actually had effective and competent leadership of U.S. aid, and having watched it in Afghanistan and Iraq, good as the people in the field are, I would honestly have to say I know of no part of the U.S. federal government which is less competent, less transparent, and less capable than the senior leadership of AID.
On the question of the Syrian alternative, the Syrian regime for the past 48 years has set the bar extremely low in terms of domestic policy, much less than regional and foreign policy. So I don't think it's going to be difficult to surpass that. But when it comes to the question of Western democracy and whether we are likely to see something emerge, whether we're likely to see something emerge in that direction, I wonder what is meant by, in public discourse, what is meant by Western democracy. Do we mean the tradition historically of racism, sexism, and classism, slavery, and all of which were based on genocide, that coexisted with political democracy for the few who were basically upper class, propertied white men? Or are we talking about Western democracy that developed over 300 years to produce stable institutions which basically include some of the fruits that we have today? If you mean the result of the struggle, no. Syria, Egypt, Tunisia will not provide that, will not produce that anytime soon. It will produce something as nasty and problematic as American history was. Perhaps it will be squeezed into less than 300 years. Perhaps it will not include the genocide of dozens of millions of people and their enslavement, but it will be squeezed into a shorter period, one hopes. And I think we should have a bit of a long breath, especially people also in the region who are quick to condemn what is happening in Egypt as actually problematic. I think lack a historical view of how these things develop, and I think we should recognize that this is going to be a very long and protracted process, and the more so to the extent that external powers are involved in it and interfering based on their own policies and their own interest rather than the interest of the people of the region. So I think we should temper these questions with a historical perspective.
Well, it's 12 o'clock. We have time for one more question from a gentleman who hasn't asked one yet, but then it is 12, so can it be short?
Sure. My question to any of the panelists who wish to address this is, with the recent announced changes at the Department of Defense and CIA and the Ambassador of Afghanistan, it would suggest that the U.S. will be primarily focused on the Afghanistan-Pakistan area over the next few years. This focus would suggest that the U.S. may not be as engaged in events of the Middle East as it could be. And my question is, will the U.S. emphasis on the Afghanistan-Pakistan region be a good thing or a bad thing to the countries affected by the Arab Spring, considering how poorly the U.S. policy is viewed in the region?
I know somebody who has an opinion on that. You want to speak about that?
Look, I was not terribly amused by the headlines in the Times and the Washington Post. It was amazing to discover that the CIA had become militarized, which, when you look at the growth pattern, which is hard to describe in public, is just flatly untrue, because given the increase in analysts, staff, and where they are assigned to, that is not what has happened. It also confuses people as being in the agency that aren't. In terms of Afghanistan and Pakistan, there's no question. The account that we call a OCO account shows that you are going to be spending a very significant amount of money on the military in Afghanistan and Pakistan through at least the next fiscal year. The administration has not announced what it will do in FY 2013, which does, according to some projections, indicate a very serious cut. Whether they can do it or not, I don't know. But I think anybody who's been in U.S. government realizes that that doesn't mean that you somehow are ignoring China or ignoring North Korea, or that you are not directly involved in the strategic importance of CENTCOM broadly, remembering that General Petraeus was the commander in CENTCOM before this. It certainly doesn't mean that Leon Panetta goes to the Defense Department to focus primarily on Afghanistan at a time when his primary role is going to be dealing with a massive domestic debate over the future of spending broadly. And I can tell you, as somebody who sometimes has to suffer the consequences, that the policy cluster in the Department of Defense, like that within the Department of State, has just as many country desks working non-Afghan and Pakistani issues as it has ever had in the past. That's just not the way the government functions. And I thought, frankly, that there probably should be a morning after on the part of the Times and the Post where they might really focus on the range of issues the community and the Defense Department actually have to face, because that was some of the worst transition reporting I think I've seen.
So the Gulf will remain important.
As will virtually, let me say, there is very unlikely to be one less desk officer for the countries outside Afghanistan and Pakistan in the foreseeable future in any country that has the slightest trouble, which probably leaves us with reductions in Luxembourg.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And we have a website, www.mepc.org, which is very rich, and I invite you to visit it.